The air in the bioengineering lab was thick with the acrid scent of ozone and burnt synthetics, a smell that clung to the back of my throat like ash. What had once been a pristine, sterile environment, a testament to cutting-edge science, was now a mangled sculpture of twisted metal, shattered glass, and carbonized equipment. I stepped over a tangle of severed cables, my boots crunching on crystalline debris, the silence of the devastation punctuated only by the distant hum of the facility's emergency ventilation system struggling against the lingering fumes. "Reed. Glad you're here." The lead detective, a man whose patience was as thin as the remaining integrity of the lab's structural beams, gestured vaguely at the ruin. "Dr. Aris Thorne. He was found him like this an hour ago. Looks like a catastrophic failure. Or maybe he brought it on himself." I didn't respond, my eyes already tracing the contours of the destruction. Thorne's lab, a fortress of innovation, was now a tomb. The security protocols here were legendary: biometric scanners, reinforced blast doors, surveillance that could pick up a dust mote's trajectory. To gain access, you practically needed to be Thorne himself, or a ghost. My gaze settled on the epicenter of the blast. A workstation, or what was left of it, stood at the heart of the damage. A scorched console, its display fused into a black mirror, dominated the space. Nearby, a specialized containment unit, designed to house volatile biological agents, lay ripped open, its thick, reinforced viewport spiderwebbed with cracks but not fully breached. That was odd. If this was a full-scale explosion, why was the containment unit still mostly intact? The preliminary assessment suggests an uncontrolled reaction, the detective continued, stepping carefully around a toppled rack of what looked like advanced genetic sequencers. Thorne was working on something big, something revolutionary. High risk, high reward. Could have easily gone sideways. He paused, his voice dropping. Or, he was under immense pressure. Financial, academic, you name it. Maybe he just decided to end it all, and took his life's work with him. I knelt beside a section of flooring, its polished surface now pitted and blackened. The heat had been intense, localized, yet the overall pattern of the damage felt uneven. Most explosions leave a concentric ring of destruction, radiating outwards. Here, it was more like a violent, focused rupture, as if a single point had erupted with explosive force, then dissipated, rather than a sustained, expanding wave. Thorne's remains lay partially obscured by a fallen ceiling panel, a grim tableau of what happens when flesh meets uncontrolled energy. His body, or what remained identifiable, was slumped against a reinforced workbench. The blast had been brutal, leaving little for traditional examination. But even from this distance, through the haze of particulate matter, something caught my eye. It wasn't the widespread charring, nor the specific way the blast had disfigured him. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible detail on the scorched cuff of his lab coat. A faint, silvered sheen, no larger than a grain of rice, glinted faintly under the beam of my penlight. It wasn't metallic residue from the lab equipment, I knew the alloys used here. This was different. Too bright, too pure, almost crystalline in its reflection. And it was embedded into the fabric, not just resting on it. My internal alarm bells, usually a low thrum of suspicion, began to resonate with a quiet, insistent urgency. A catastrophic lab accident, a suicide by scientific immolation, both scenarios painted a picture of widespread, indiscriminate destruction. But this tiny, anomalous speck, The singular point of iridescent silver felt too precise. It felt placed. The remains are being transported to the military medical facility restricted autopsy section, the lead detective stated, pulling me momentarily from my thoughts. They'll try to piece together what they can. Good luck with the rest of this mess. I nodded. Absently, my focus still on that minute detail. The detective, satisfied he'd given me the rundown, moved off to confer with a uniformed officer. He saw a closed case, a tragic end to a brilliant mind. I saw a question mark. A suicide or accident would leave a signature of chaos, a broad stroke of devastation. But this speck, this almost invisible anomaly, suggested a different kind of hand at work. A meticulous hand. A hand that understood the mechanics of this lab, the precise vulnerabilities, and the specific composition of Thorne's cutting-edge work. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make this look like an accident, or a desperate act. And they had almost succeeded. Almost. I pulled out my evidence kit, the sterile gleam of my tools a stark contrast to the surrounding wreckage. The hunt for answers had just begun, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was going to be anything but straightforward. The truth, I suspected, was buried deep beneath the ashes, waiting for a meticulous eye to uncover it. And I intended to be that eye. Misery twinged. I moved closer to what remained of Thorne's main workstation, careful not to disturb anything. The console was a melted sculpture of plastic and wires, but beneath its ruin, a faint, almost imperceptible detail snagged my attention. A scorch mark on the reinforced floor, no larger than my thumb, stood out against the broader charring. It was a perfect, almost geometric circle, darker, more intense than the surrounding damage, as if a pinpoint of extreme heat had been applied before the general conflagration. It didn't fit the narrative of a chaotic explosion. Explosions were messy, unpredictable. This mark suggested precision, control. It was a whisper of intent and a scream of destruction, and I already knew this case was going to be anything but simple. The preliminary autopsy report, delivered by the medical examiner in her perpetually cool office in the police department basement holding forensic samples, only deepened my skepticism. No defensive wounds, Reed, he reported, his voice dry as he flipped through the digital images. But the thermal damage. It's peculiar. The core temperature sustained by the body suggests a much higher, more focused energy release than the general lab temperature would indicate for the duration. She pointed to a detailed scan. See here? Localized tissue necrosis, almost surgical in its precision, despite the overall widespread trauma. It's like he was hit directly by something incredibly hot, something contained, before the lab itself went up. So, not just a bystander to a general explosion? I asked, leaning forward. No. He was the focal point, or at least, a highly targeted element within the event. And there's this. She pushed a small, clear evidence bag across the table. Inside, nestled against a sterile cotton swab, was a suicide or accident would leave a signature of chaos, a broad stroke of the brush. What I'd seen in Thorne's lab was too precise, too neatly catastrophic. The burn patterns, the microscopic trace, they whispered of something else entirely. My next stop was the military medical facility restricted autopsy section. The fluorescent lights hummed with a clinical indifference, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare on everything. The air was cold, sterile, thick with the scent of disinfectants and something else, something metallic and final. A lone forensic examiner, a man with tired eyes and remarkably steady hands, was already at work when I arrived. He acknowledged me with a curt nod, his attention fixed on the subject on the steel table. "Read," he mumbled, without looking up. "You're early. Figured you'd want a look." "Always," I replied, pulling on a pair of fresh gloves. I approached the table slowly, my gaze sweeping over Dr. Thorne's remains. The exterior damage had been extensive, consistent with the explosion, but the examiner had already begun the painstaking process of revealing what lay beneath. The skin, where intact, was pale, almost translucent. I focused on the hands, the fingers. They were singed, yes, but there was an unnatural rigidity to them, a clenching that seemed more than just post-mortem contraction. Initial assessment points to massive blunt force trauma and extensive thermal injuries, the examiner stated, his voice flat, professional. He pointed with a gloved finger to a specific area on Thorne's forearm. "But look here. Just beneath the surface charring. See that?" I leaned closer, my eyes tracing the faint, almost imperceptible discoloration. It wasn't just a burn. It was a faint, linear mark, distinct from the broader thermal damage. Like a brand, or a contact point. "Something was pressed against him," I murmured, more to myself than to the examiner. "And it wasn't part of the general concussive force." The examiner grunted, resuming his work. "My thoughts exactly. Too localized. Too deliberate." I spent another hour there, observing, taking mental notes, asking pointed questions about tissue samples and residue. The examiner's meticulous work confirmed my suspicion: the incident wasn't a simple explosion. There were anomalies, small inconsistencies that chipped away at the accident narrative. The specific type of residue found in certain burn areas, for instance, didn't quite match the general lab chemicals. It was a signature, yes, but not of chaos. Of control. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the digital forensics lab, a windowless room humming with the quiet thrum of high-powered servers. The lead analyst, a woman with quick, intelligent eyes, had already extracted Thorne's primary research drives. "We're sifting through everything, read," he explained, gesturing to a bank of monitors displaying lines of code and file directories. "This is heavy stuff. Advanced genetic sequencing, applications in, well, either global health or bioweaponry, depending on who you ask." I nodded, my attention snagging on a specific directory tree. Focus on his recent project files. Anything from the last 6 months. Hours blurred into a methodical hunt. My eyes scanned through thousands of file names, timestamps, and access logs. The analyst worked efficiently beside me, executing my commands, pulling up specific data sets. Then, I saw it. A cluster of files, marked with innocuous-sounding names, but with access dates that were subtly off. Not by much, just a few minutes, but enough to trigger a red flag in my mind. "Pull up the audit logs for these files," I instructed, pointing to a sequence of entries. "Specifically, look for any external access or unusual modifications." The analyst typed rapidly. The screen flickered, displaying a granular history. "Here we go," she said, her voice tightening. "Look at this. A series of access attempts, not from Thorne's usual network ID, and they're recent. within the last 48 hours. My gaze narrowed. Attempted data wipe? Looks like it, she confirmed, scrolling down. Sophisticated, too. Not a simple delete. Someone tried to mask their tracks, overwrite the original data with junk files. But Thorne's system had a robust backup protocol. It retained ghost images. The ghost images, once recovered, painted a stark picture. Specific project files, detailing the most sensitive aspects of Thorne's advanced genetic sequencing research, had been targeted. Not just deleted, but systematically purged and overwritten. An external party, intimately familiar with the lab's digital infrastructure, had gained access. Or Thorne himself was trying to hide something. The tension in the room thickened, a silent acknowledgement of the implications. This wasn't just about a lab accident anymore. This was about a deliberate act, a calculated effort to erase specific knowledge. My next step was to talk to Maya, Thorne's assistant. I found her in a secure interview room, clutching a mug of lukewarm tea. She looked like a bird caught in a storm. Maya, I began gently, sitting opposite her. I need you to tell me about Dr. Thorne's recent work. Anything unusual, anything at all. She took a shaky breath. He was different these last few months. Distant. He'd always been reclusive, but this was more. He was paranoid. Paranoid about what? I pressed, leaning forward slightly. She wrung her hands. He thought he was being watched. He'd check the cameras constantly, change his passwords every day. He even started encrypting his personal notes, something he never did before. Said his work was too important, too dangerous, to fall into the wrong hands. Did he ever mention who he thought was watching him? Maya shook her head, her gaze fixed on the table. No names. Just vague things. They're always listening, he'd say. They want what I have. He was convinced someone was trying to steal his research. He told me if anything ever happened to him, I should tell someone to look at the Phoenix Protocol files. He said they held the key. Phoenix Protocol. It hadn't appeared in the recovered ghost images. This meant it was either deeply buried, or the attempted wipe had been more successful than I'd initially thought. Maya's words, vague and unsettling, confirmed my suspicion. Thorne knew he was in danger. The question now was, what was the Phoenix Protocol, and who wanted it so badly? Thorne kept secrets, I finished, the thought hanging in the sterile air of the lab. The Phoenix Protocol wasn't just a data wipe, it was a ghost in the machine, a deliberate act to obscure something significant. The fragmented data hinted at a project far grander, and far more dangerous, than anything the initial reports suggested. My gut tightened. This wasn't a tragic accident. It was a targeted strike. The microscopic residue I'd scraped from the scorched console, barely visible even under the field microscope, became my immediate focus. It was a peculiar, almost iridescent speck, unlike anything I'd encountered in typical lab fires. If the killer had been meticulous enough to wipe the digital slate clean, they likely wouldn't have left such a physical calling card by accident. I secured the sample in a hermetically sealed vial, the tiny fleck of evidence a monumental weight in my hand. The next step was specialized analysis, a level of scrutiny that required resources beyond my standard mobile kit. I made the necessary calls, navigating layers of bureaucracy, emphasizing the high-priority nature of the Thorne case. The air was cool, smelling faintly of ozone and disinfectant, a constant reminder of the precise, often grim, work conducted within these walls. The section was a fortress of scientific rigor, equipped with instruments that could dissect a single photon if necessary. I handed the vial to the lead specialist, a stoic individual whose gaze seemed to dissect the sample before it even reached their gloved hand. "We're looking for a unique spectral signature," I explained, my voice low. "Anything that doesn't fit standard combustion byproducts or common lab materials." The specialist nodded, already positioning the vial under the electron microscope. Thermal decomposition analysis, X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy, secondary ion mass spectrometry, they rattled off, their movements economical and precise. "We'll find what it is, or what it isn't." I watched for what felt like an eternity, the specialist and their team working with silent intensity. Screens glowed with complex graphs and abstract molecular structures. My attention was fixed on the main monitor, where the specialist was running a high-resolution spectral scan of the residue. The initial readings were inconclusive, a jumble of common elements. But then, a subtle shift. A peak emerged, small but distinct, on the edge of the spectrum. The specialist zoomed in, their brow furrowed. "There," they murmured, pointing with a sterile stylus. "Anomalous signature. Not organic. Not a standard inorganic compound either. Looks like a polymer." My breath hitched. A polymer. Not a trace from Thorne's biological work, nor a byproduct of a lab explosion. This was something introduced. Further analysis confirmed it. The specialist highlighted the specific spectral fingerprint. "It's a synthetic polymer, read. Extremely pure. Its unique elemental composition points to a very specialized manufacturing process. High thermal stability, high tensile strength. Used in high-end industrial applications. Aerospace, advanced composites, maybe some specific medical devices, but not the kind you'd find lying around a bioengineering lab." "Rare?" I asked, my mind already racing. "Exceedingly," the specialist confirmed. "Not mass-produced. Custom synthesized for niche, high-performance needs. It's expensive, difficult to work with, and requires proprietary methods." The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't about academic rivalries anymore. This wasn't a disgruntled colleague or a failed experiment. This polymer pointed to a world of corporate espionage, industrial secrets, and vast sums of money. Thorne's research, whatever the Phoenix Protocol was meant to protect, had attracted a predator from the industrial sector. My thoughts immediately turned to Omnicorp. The conglomerate had been one of Thorne's primary funders, known for its aggressive pursuit of R&D dominance, swallowing smaller companies and poaching top talent. Their reach was vast, their ethical boundaries often ambiguous. If anyone had the resources and motive to develop such a specialized material, and then use it to orchestrate a sophisticated murder, it was Omnicorp. I spent the rest of the day digging, correlating the polymer's properties with known industrial applications and Omnicorp's extensive patent portfolio. While no direct match surfaced, a proprietary material wouldn't be public, the circumstantial evidence piled up. Omnicorp had several subsidiaries specializing in advanced materials and high-performance composites. The next morning, I secured an interview with Omnicorp's liaison to Thorne's project, a woman named Ilara. Her office, high in a gleaming corporate tower, was all polished steel and panoramic city views, a stark contrast to the grimy reality of a crime scene. He was impeccably dressed, her smile wide, almost too wide, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Investigator Reed," he greeted, extending a perfectly manicured hand. Her grip was firm, her voice smooth, practiced. "We're all deeply saddened by Dr. Thorne's passing. A true visionary. How can Omnicorp assist your investigation?" I sat opposite her, my gaze steady. "We're looking into the specifics of Dr. Thorne's funding, particularly related to the Phoenix Protocol project." Her smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something, surprise? Calculation, crossed her eyes. "Ah, the Phoenix Protocol. A fascinating initiative. Omnicorp was proud to contribute. It was Dr. Thorne's concept for a secure, distributed data network for scientific collaboration. A noble goal, truly. A data network?" I pressed, leaning forward slightly. My understanding from the recovered fragments was that it involved something more. Biologically focused. Perhaps a new genetic sequencing method? "Oh, Dr. Thorne had many irons in the fire," she chuckled, a light, dismissive sound. "The protocol was primarily about information security for his broader research. We supported the infrastructure, the advanced encryption. He was very particular about data integrity." She paused, then added, "He was also working on a next-generation biosensor. Perhaps that's what you're referring to?" Her eagerness to provide an alternative, plausible explanation for Phoenix Protocol was almost alarming. He was offering too much, too easily. "And Omnicorp's involvement with the advanced materials used in Dr. Thorne's lab?" I asked, shifting tactics. "Specifically, a rare synthetic polymer with high thermal stability." "Do you recognize that description?" Her smile finally tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Omnicorp manufactures thousands of proprietary materials, investigator. We're at the forefront of innovation." Without a more specific identifier, I couldn't possibly comment. Was this material found at the site? Her tone was still cooperative, but now laced with a practiced caution. "It was," I confirmed. "A microscopic trace. Consistent with a highly specialized, custom-synthesized product." She took a sip of water, her gaze drifting to the cityscape outside. "Well, if it's one of ours, I assure you it would have been supplied through official channels. Omnicorp adheres to the strictest protocols regarding material tracking and intellectual property. Perhaps it was a component of some equipment supplied to Dr. Thorne's lab?" "Perhaps," I said, letting the silence stretch. Her explanation was too neat, too readily available. The overly cooperative demeanor was a shield, deflecting direct inquiry while offering a smokescreen of plausible deniability. He was a master of corporate rhetoric. As the interview concluded, Ilara reiterated Omnicorp's full cooperation, offering access to their internal records, an offer I knew would be a carefully curated data dump designed to mislead. I left her gleaming office with a knot of tension in my stomach. The killer hadn't just erased digital footprints, they had used a ghost material, a signature that pointed directly to a corporate behemoth. And Omnicorp, through its evasive liaison, had just painted a target on its own back. The web of connections was tightening, and I knew I was only just beginning to untangle it. My focus narrowed to the microscopic, a familiar comfort in the chaos of the larger world. The sample of polymer, no larger than a grain of sand, sat on the slide beneath the electron microscope. Its structure was a marvel of synthetic ingenuity, a tightly woven lattice that spoke of deliberate design, not accidental byproduct. I'd spent the better part of the morning isolating it, sifting through the debris from Thorne's destroyed lab. The initial report from the lead investigator had dismissed it as incidental, but my gut gnawed at that easy conclusion. This material wasn't incidental, it was specific. Its isotopic signature hinted at a unique origin, a bespoke synthesis that defied any commercial database I could access. I was closing in, not on what it was, but where it came from. My head throbbed, a dull ache behind my eyes from hours of peering into the digital abyss. I needed air. I logged out, secured the sample in its designated vault, and headed for the exit, the heavy steel door groaning shut behind me. The drive back to my own facility, a nondescript building tucked away on the city's industrial fringe, was usually unremarkable. Today, however, the air felt charged, thick with an unspoken anticipation. I was 3 blocks from my turnoff, navigating a stretch of road lined with dormant warehouses, when the incident occurred. A heavy-duty flatbed truck, laden with what looked like rusted steel beams, veered suddenly from the oncoming lane. No indicator, no warning. Just a sudden, violent swerve directly into my path. I slammed my foot on the brake, the tires screaming in protest, the anti-lock system rattling beneath me. My vehicle lurched sideways, a desperate dance on the asphalt. The truck's massive grille filled my windshield, a monstrous, chrome-plated maw. I saw the driver's profile for a fleeting instant, a shadowed face, obscured by a low-brimmed cap, eyes fixed forward, devoid of panic or surprise. He didn't even correct his course until the last possible second, missing my front bumper by mere inches, the rush of displaced air rocking my car. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, the truck straightened, accelerating away without a glance in its rearview mirror. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against bone. My hands, white-knuckled, gripped the steering wheel. That wasn't an accident. A warning. Someone knew I was getting too close. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to continue the drive. The incident solidified a suspicion that had been festering for days. Thorne's death wasn't just a lab accident. The polymer, the unusual burn patterns, the corporate stonewalling, it was all part of a larger, more sinister design. Back in my lab, the familiar scent of ozone and sterilized equipment usually brought a sense of calm. Today, it felt different. A subtle shift. Nothing overtly broken, no forced entry, but my senses, honed by years of meticulous observation, prickled. My desk, usually a precisely organized landscape of notes and reference materials, seemed off. A stack of printouts, which I distinctly remembered aligning with the edge of the desk, was now angled slightly, a millimeter or two out of place. My secure drive, its LED usually a steady green, was blinking. I hadn't left it blinking. I approached cautiously, my hand hovering over the emergency panic button concealed beneath the desk. I ran a diagnostic on the drive. No data breach, no files accessed, but a timestamp indicated a brief, unauthorized power cycle, less than a second long, occurring while I was en route. A phantom touch. Someone had been here, within the supposed sanctity of my personal workspace, a silent intrusion that bypassed all my standard safeguards. They hadn't stolen anything, hadn't left any obvious damage. They had just been there. Another message. I spent the next hour meticulously checking every corner of my lab, every sensor, every hidden camera. Nothing. They were good. Too good. This wasn't some opportunistic thief, this was someone with resources, with knowledge of my habits, my security protocols. Later that evening, as the city lights began to bleed across the skyline, a tentative knock echoed on my lab door. I tensed, my hand instinctively going to the small, concealed weapon I kept. "Come in," I called out, my voice betraying none of the apprehension I felt. It was Maya, the junior researcher from Thorne's project. "I can't keep this to myself anymore. I'm scared." I gestured to the chair opposite my desk. "What is it, Maya?" I kept my voice even, encouraging. "What's bothering you?" She sat, her gaze darting around the room as if expecting to see hidden eyes. It was before the explosion. A few weeks ago, maybe a month. I was working late, trying to finish some reports for Thorne. He was demanding with deadlines. She wrung her hands. I left the lab around 2 in the morning. The main lights were off, but I saw a light on in Thorne's private section. Not his usual bright overheads, but a dim, almost blue glow. My pulse quickened. "Did you see who it was?" "No," she shook her head, her voice cracking. "The door was mostly closed, just a sliver of light." "But I heard something." A faint hum, like equipment running, but not any of Thorne's usual gear, and a figure. Tall. Broad-shouldered. I only saw a silhouette through the frosted glass of the door, moving around inside. I thought it was Thorne at first, but then I realized. His gait. It wasn't his. Thorne had a slight limp, you know? This person moved. Fluidly. Almost silently. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. She swallowed hard. I was terrified. Thorne was so secretive about his work. He had a zero-tolerance policy for anyone poking around his private lab. I panicked. I thought if I reported it, he'd fire me, or worse. I just ran, didn't look back. I convinced myself it was nothing, a trick of the light. But after what happened? She trailed off, tears welling in her eyes. I saw the news about the official report, saying it was an accident. But I know what I saw. The polymer, the sophisticated breach of my lab, the near miss on the road, and now Maya's terrified confession. Someone had been in Thorne's lab, not just once, but seemingly with access and purpose. This wasn't a random act, it was a carefully orchestrated plot, and I was stepping directly into the path of its architect. The game had just escalated. The pieces clicked into place with a chilling finality. This wasn't a random act, it was a carefully orchestrated sabotage. Someone had been in Thorne's lab, not just once, but with intimate access and a precise, deadly purpose. My gut clenched, a cold certainty solidifying in my mind. I had to understand how. I returned to Thorne's lab, the sterile environment now feeling less like a scene of tragedy and more like a stage for a meticulously planned execution. The security logs, environmental control readouts, equipment diagnostics, a sprawling tapestry of data that, on the surface, looked unremarkable. But I knew better. The devil was in the micro-variations, the fractional discrepancies. My eyes scanned lines of code, timestamps, and sensor readings. The lab's bespoke environmental system was designed for hypersensitivity, maintaining specific atmospheric compositions for Thorne's delicate bioengineering work. Any deviation, however slight, was logged. They weren't sudden spikes, but gradual, controlled shifts, like a tide slowly turning. The initial changes began 24 hours before Thorne's death, subtle enough to be dismissed as sensor drift or minor system adjustments. But they escalated, a multi-stage manipulation. First, a barely detectable increase in the inert gas, displacing oxygen by fractions of a percent. Then, a carefully timed sequence of equipment activations, not full power cycles, but brief, low-level pulses to specific reactors and purification units, all designed to subtly alter the atmospheric pressure and temperature within the containment field. Each step was like a single brushstroke in a larger, sinister painting, building towards an inevitable conclusion. I cross-referenced these digital anomalies with the physical scene. The unusual burn pattern I'd noted on the floor, the microscopic trace of a specific catalytic residue, they now began to make sense. The subtle shifts in gas composition, combined with the pulsed equipment activations, would have created a highly localized, volatile environment, far more potent than any single malfunction. It wasn't an explosion in the traditional sense, but a rapid, contained combustion event triggered by a precise confluence of factors. My fingers flew across the holographic interface, reconstructing the timeline. At the precise moment of Thorne's death, the system registered a final, critical spike in atmospheric pressure within his immediate working area, followed by an instantaneous drop in oxygen levels and a surge of heat. It was too perfect, too synchronized. This wasn't an accident. This was a choreographed event, designed to look like one. The remote trigger was the key. The logs showed no direct manual override from within the lab. These packets weren't commands to hack the system, they were perfectly formatted, authorized instructions, indistinguishable from Thorne's own remote access protocols. Someone hadn't broken in, they'd used the back door, perhaps even a key. This meant the killer didn't just understand Thorne's work, they knew his specific operating procedures, his unique system architecture, even his remote access credentials. They had weaponized his own lab against him, turning his genius into his grave. The precision involved was staggering, a digital dance of death executed with surgical exactitude. To confirm the physiological impact of such an engineered event, I needed to review the full forensic pathology report in person. I packed my equipment, the hum of the servers fading behind me as I drove towards the designated facility. Inside, the air was cool, sterile, and silent. A forensic pathologist, a woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, met me in a small viewing room. You wanted to discuss Thorne's internal findings. Rapid atmospheric event. I need to correlate it with the physical evidence. She gestured to a highlighted section. Acute anoxia, certainly. But the contributing factor was a rapid, severe thermal shock, consistent with a flash combustion event at close proximity. There was also evidence of a unique catalytic residue in the pulmonary system, trace amounts, but definite. We initially categorized it as an unknown accelerant, likely part of his experimental materials, given the lab setting. That residue, I confirmed, matches a proprietary catalyst Thorne used in very specific, high-energy reactions. And the thermal shock, the anoxia. It perfectly aligns with a multi-stage manipulation of the lab's environmental controls, culminating in a localized, self-sustaining combustion within Thorne's immediate workspace. The pathologist's eyebrows rose. So, not an accident. No, I said, the word a cold stone in the quiet room. A meticulously engineered murder. Someone knew exactly how Thorne worked, what his systems were capable of, and how to turn his own brilliance against him. And they did it all remotely. The implications hit me with renewed force. This wasn't just a killer, this was an architect of death, operating with a level of knowledge that pointed to an insider. Someone within Thorne's inner circle, or perhaps even closer. The tension in the air was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the dangerous path I was now on. The killer was still out there, precise, knowledgeable, and utterly ruthless. Steel tables gleamed under stark lights, and the scent of antiseptic clung to everything, a sterile shroud over the grim work conducted here. I wasn't here for the physical remains, not anymore. My focus was on the digital ghost of Thorne's last days. A uniformed guard, a stoic figure with a gaze that could peel paint, had ushered me into a small, secured bay off the main examination area. Here, tucked away in a lockbox, were Thorne's personal effects deemed too sensitive for standard handling. Among them was a tablet, heavily encrypted, that I suspected held more than just casual notes. The detective overseeing the chain of custody had handed it over with a grunt, a clear indication of his dwindling patience with my unconventional methods. I sat at a narrow counter, the tablet cool and inert in my hands. The elaborate nature of Thorne's death, the meticulous staging of the accident, had been gnawing at me since I'd left the lab. It wasn't just the unique burn patterns or the microscopic residue, it was the sheer effort involved. If the killer had simply wanted Thorne's research, a quick, clean kill and a data transfer would have sufficed. The destruction of the lab, the carefully orchestrated chaos, it pointed to something else entirely. My fingers traced the cold glass of the tablet. Why go to such lengths? The answer that had been forming in the back of my mind solidified: prevention. The killer hadn't just wanted to steal Thorne's work, they wanted to stop him from completing it, or perhaps, from releasing it to the world. That meant the research itself wasn't just valuable, it was dangerous in Thorne's hands, or at least, in the way he intended to use it. I powered on the device. A standard login screen appeared, followed quickly by a more complex biometric and password prompt. Thorne was famously meticulous, almost paranoid, about his data security. It took me hours, sifting through his known digital habits, cross-referencing fragments of information from his discarded notes, even testing theories based on his academic interests. The guard outside remained a silent, unmoving sentinel, occasionally pacing the short length of the corridor. The only sounds were the distant clatter from other sections and the rhythmic clicking of my own attempts. Frustration simmered, a low heat beneath my determination. Every failed attempt reinforced the killer's advantage. If I couldn't get in, neither could anyone else easily piece together Thorne's final thoughts. This wasn't just a puzzle, it was a race. Someone had died to keep these secrets buried. Then, a flicker. A sequence of characters, derived from a seemingly innocuous date in a published paper Thorne had co-authored, combined with a specific biometric scan I'd managed to lift from a partial print on a discarded coffee cup at his lab. It was a long shot, a theory based on his tendency to weave personal significance into his most secure encryptions. The screen shimmered. A new directory appeared, labeled with a string of seemingly random characters. It was a hidden partition. This was it. I clicked. The directory opened to a series of dated entries, not typical lab data logs, but personal reflections, almost a diary. I scrolled quickly, my eyes scanning for anything out of place, anything that echoed the growing suspicion in my gut. The entries started innocuously enough, discussing experimental parameters, observations on cellular growth. But then, the tone shifted. August 14th, the new funding allocation from Omnicorp is generous. Alarmingly so. Their interest in the application phase of the neural interface seems to have intensified beyond simple therapeutic uses. My initial proposals were clear, restorative, enhancing. Not militaristic. My eyes widened. Omnicorp. The corporate giant known for its shadowy investments and aggressive acquisitions. He spoke of strategic defense and preemptive capabilities. He showed me schematics, crude and theoretical, but unmistakable. They want to weaponize the core principles of my cognitive transfer protocol. Not for healing, but for control. 4. Something far more sinister. A knot tightened in my stomach. This wasn't just about stealing research. This was about perverting it. October 1st, I've discovered their clandestine project. Separate from my own, but drawing heavily from my foundational work, twisted into something monstrous. They are funding a parallel effort, deep underground, to integrate my findings with something called Project Chimera. It uses targeted neural disruption, not for repair, but for incapacitation or worse. Total mental subjugation. This is not what I signed up for. I leaned closer, the words on the screen burning into my vision. Project Chimera. The air in the sterile bay suddenly felt thin, heavy with the weight of Thorne's desperate confessions. October 20th, I can't let this happen. My work, my legacy, used for such an abomination. I have begun compiling all evidence. The funding trails, the communications, the preliminary schematics of Project Chimera. I will expose Omnicorp. I will go public. The world needs to know what they are building, and what they intend to do with it. The last entry was dated 2 days before his death. Thorne wasn't just a victim of a lab accident, or even a simple theft. The killer hadn't merely wanted his research, they wanted to erase any trace of his opposition, any hint of Omnicorp's true intentions. The architect of death wasn't just an insider, they were an enforcer, protecting a secret that could shatter global trust and unleash a new kind of weapon. And now, I held the key to that secret. The tension in the sterile room wasn't just in my head anymore, it was real, a palpable pressure, a silent warning. Thorne wasn't just a victim, he was a whistleblower, silenced before he could expose a corporate conspiracy. The truth, stark and chilling, laid bare before me, demanding immediate action. It wasn't my usual environment for data analysis, but the sensitivity of Thorne's case, coupled with the classified nature of his research, had dictated this secure, isolated space. A forensic technician, a woman with tired eyes and precise movements, was meticulously cataloging tissue samples at a stainless steel counter across the room. She barely acknowledged my presence, her focus absolute. I settled at a secure workstation in a small, partition area of the section, a terminal humming softly. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the lab's access logs. Thousands of entries, each a time-stamped fingerprint, detailing who entered and exited Thorne's high-security research facility. I cross-referenced these with employee profiles, focusing on individuals with the specific technical expertise required to execute the sophisticated sabotage I now knew had occurred. The initial explosion, the subsequent fire, the carefully manipulated failsafes, it all pointed to an intimate knowledge of Thorne's experimental setup. This wasn't a random act of violence, it was a surgical strike, precise and calculated. I filtered the list, first by security clearance, then by technical certifications relevant to Thorne's bioengineering field. The pool of potential suspects, initially vast, began to shrink, coalescing into a disturbingly small group. I layered on another filter, motive. Thorne's final journal entries had been explicit about the corporate conspiracy, the impending exposure. Who stood to lose the most from his revelations? Omnicorp, naturally. And who within Omnicorp had direct, unrestricted access to Thorne's lab and his research? My gaze landed on the profile of the Omnicorp liaison. He was a constant presence in the access logs, often entering the lab outside regular working hours, sometimes shortly before Thorne himself, sometimes after. His official role was to facilitate communication and resource allocation between Omnicorp and Thorne's independent research arm. A perfect cover. I clicked on his detailed profile, a standard corporate dossier. Name, contact information, educational background, all unremarkable. But then I scrolled further, past the surface-level details, past the innocuous career progression within Omnicorp. There was a section labeled Special Projects. My gut tightened. This was it. The liaison's early career wasn't in corporate management or scientific administration. It was in a specialized, highly classified government agency, a unit notorious for its involvement in intelligence gathering and what was euphemistically termed asset protection. Covert operations. The words flashed on the screen, stark and undeniable. My breath hitched. This wasn't just an insider, this was a trained operative. The meticulous planning, the complete absence of traditional forensic markers, the sophisticated nature of the sabotage, it all clicked into place. This man wasn't merely a corporate functionary, he was a ghost, trained to move without leaving a trace. A reference to a past incident, buried deep in his background checks, flagged by an automated system for potential conflict of interest. A scandal involving stolen intellectual property from a competing bioengineering firm, years ago. The case had been quietly settled, sealed, the details obscured. But the connection was there, a faint, almost invisible thread linking the liaison to a history of corporate espionage and illicit acquisition of research. My mind raced, connecting the dots. Thorne's groundbreaking research, potentially world-changing. The corporate conspiracy he was about to expose. The liaison, with a background in covert operations and a history of involvement in stolen intellectual property. It wasn't just about silencing a whistleblower, it was about seizing control of Thorne's work, ensuring it fell into Omnicorp's hands, or perhaps even a third party's, without a trace of legal entanglement. I was no longer just investigating a murder, I was uncovering a deep-seated network, a dangerous game played with human lives and scientific breakthroughs as pawns. The killer wasn't merely an employee with a grudge, he was a professional, an invisible hand with the training and the motive to execute a flawless, untraceable act of sabotage. The Omnicorp liaison. He wasn't just a suspect, he was the prime suspect, the inside man. And he was far more dangerous than I had initially imagined. I needed to move, to connect the dots, to set a trap. David Thorne, Aris's own brother, was my primary suspect. His evasiveness, his intimate knowledge of Aris's work, and his position within Omnicorp all pointed to him. But I needed more than suspicion, I needed a confession, or at least an overt act of guilt. I orchestrated the leak with meticulous care. In the sterile, hushed corridors of the facility, I spoke loudly, deliberately, to a junior investigator, ensuring my words would carry. The new spectral analysis on the Project Chimera remnants, I said, my voice echoing slightly off the polished concrete walls, suggests a breakthrough. A critical component, thought destroyed, appears to have yielded viable data. Enough to reverse engineer Thorne's final, most volatile research. The details were just vague enough to sound plausible, but specific enough to hint at the true nature of Aris's bioweapon research, a secret only the killer would truly understand the gravity of. The junior investigator nodded, oblivious, scribbling notes. I watched from the corner of my eye as a cleaner, positioned perfectly down the hall, paused, broom frozen mid-sweep, before resuming with a sudden, almost frantic energy. My bait was cast. The waiting was the hardest part. Hours crawled by, each minute stretching into an eternity. The facility was a labyrinth of secured zones, each requiring specific clearance. No casual visitor could simply wander in. This was a place of secrets, and I banked on David Thorne's desperation to protect one of the biggest. The profile was unmistakable, even through the grainy night vision. David Thorne. He moved with a purpose, bypassing the usual entry points, heading directly for the restricted section. He didn't use a keycard, he used a specific, almost surgical, manipulation of the electronic lock, a method I recognized as one Aris Thorne himself had designed for emergency access. A clear sign of insider knowledge. I let him enter the lab space, watching him on the internal cameras. He moved swiftly, heading straight for the secure refrigeration units where the most sensitive tissue samples and environmental swabs were stored. He pulled out a small, specialized device from his pocket, something designed to emit a targeted electromagnetic pulse, capable of corrupting digital data and rendering biological samples inert. His head snapped up, eyes darting around the empty lab before landing on the one-way mirror where I stood. His face, visible in the stark overhead lights, was a mask of shock, then dawning realization. I stepped out from the observation room, the heavy door hissing shut behind me. David Thorne slowly turned, his device still clutched in his hand. "Reed. What are you doing here? This section is restricted." His voice was tight, strained. "I could ask you the same thing," I countered, closing the distance between us. "But I think I already know the answer." "You heard about the breakthrough, didn't you? The one that would expose everything." He swallowed hard. "I don't know what you're talking about." I was checking on a processing error. A late shift. His eyes flickered towards the door, searching for an escape. "Don't bother," I said, gesturing towards the security cameras. "Every door is locked, every exit monitored." And your processing error excuse won't hold up, not when you're carrying a high-frequency data scrambler. I paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. Let's talk about the polymer, David. The unique, synthetic polymer found at 3 separate scenes. His jaw tightened. He said nothing, but his gaze dropped, betraying him. We found it in Aris's lab, a microscopic residue near the primary reactor console. We also found it, I continued, stepping closer, at the scene of my own accident, embedded in the fragments of the sabotaged braking system in my vehicle. And again, a faint trace on the tripwire that nearly took me out in my own apartment. A polymer with a very specific molecular signature, one that our analysts have traced back to a prototype containment lining used exclusively in high-level bioagent research. Research that Aris Thorne was conducting, and that you, his brother and a senior Omnicorp project manager, would have had intimate knowledge of. A polymer that, ironically, was designed to contain a bioweapon, not facilitate its creation. I watched his facade crumble. The controlled composure dissolved into a flicker of panic, then a profound weariness. His shoulders slumped. He couldn't live with it. He threatened to go public, to blow the whistle on the entire Omnicorp faction responsible. His eyes, now devoid of their earlier defiance, met mine. They tasked me. They said if I didn't neutralize him, they'd destroy both of us. They'd make it look like a tragic lab accident, and then frame me for corporate espionage. A shudder ran through him. I tried to talk him out of it, to convince him to run. But he was relentless. He said the truth had to come out. He paused, a profound sorrow etched onto his face. I couldn't let him expose it all and take me down with him. And then you started digging. You found the polymer, didn't you? The trace from the containment field Aris was trying to dismantle. I had to make it look like an accident. I never meant to hurt anyone else, Reed. Just. The truth, finally spoken, felt heavier than any evidence I had collected. The confession had been a dam breaking, a torrent of calculated cruelty and corporate ambition that had drowned Aris Thorne. The silence that followed David's final, chilling words felt heavier than the humid air in the interrogation chamber. My gaze remained fixed on him, a man now stripped bare, his composure shattered, his face a mask of weary resignation. He offered no further resistance as the enforcement officers, who had been waiting just outside the door, entered to take him into custody. The metallic click of the restraints echoed in the small room, a stark punctuation mark to the end of a meticulously crafted deception. I watched as they led him away, his shoulders slumped, the arrogant tilt of his head gone. There was no triumph in my chest, only a profound weariness. The truth, once elusive, now felt like a lead weight. Aris Thorne had not just been murdered, he had been sacrificed, a pawn in a game of unimaginable stakes. The unraveling of Omnicorp began with a speed that astonished even me. David's testimony, corroborated by the digital footprints I had painstakingly pieced together and the physical evidence from the lab, provided the linchpin. Within hours, warrants were issued. Senior executives, their names previously whispered in hushed tones in corporate corridors, were apprehended. The news broke like a sonic boom, ripping through the carefully constructed facade of the multinational corporation. Overnight, Omnicorp, once an untouchable titan of innovation, became a symbol of unchecked greed and scientific malfeasance. My days blurred into a relentless cycle of debriefings, evidence reviews, and consultations with the prosecuting team. The media, a ravenous beast, descended, transforming the story into a global spectacle. Every major news outlet ran with it. Headlines screamed about betrayal, about the shadowy underbelly of scientific advancement. Images of Aris Thorne, once a reclusive genius, now adorned every screen, his face a tragic emblem of ambition gone awry. Protesters gathered outside Omnicorp's gleaming headquarters, their signs condemning the company, demanding justice. The public's shock was palpable, a collective gasp of disbelief at the depth of the deception. It was a place of stark realities, where the final, irrefutable truths were laid bare. The chief examiner, a stoic woman with eyes that had seen too much, walked me through the final report on Aris Thorne. We stood over a stainless steel table, a monitor displaying high-resolution images of the microscopic burn patterns, the specific residue on the ventilation system, the very details that had first snagged my attention. To homicide by targeted atmospheric alteration, followed by thermal incapacitation. The initial explosion was a diversion, as you suspected, designed to obscure the true method. I nodded, absorbing the clinical pronouncement. I traced the outline of a projected image on the screen, a magnified view of a minute fracture in a component that had been declared perfectly sound in the initial inspection. This, I murmured, this was the key. The perfect alibi built on a manufactured flaw. The chief examiner simply inclined his head. A sophisticated operation. Read. Beyond anything we usually see. The ethical debate surrounding his research, the very project David Thorne and his co-conspirators had sought to weaponize, now raged in public forums. Was scientific advancement inherently dangerous? Could humanity be trusted with power that bordered on creation? These questions, once confined to academic journals, were now shouted from news channels and debated in every household. The true prize, the underlying reason for Aris Thorne's murder, was his groundbreaking research itself. Governments, sensing the strategic advantage, began to exert pressure. International organizations, citing humanitarian concerns, demanded oversight. The project, once a secret, now hung like a tantalizing, dangerous fruit, ripe for the plucking. Omnicorp, or what remained of it, was being dismantled, its assets scrutinized, its intellectual property fought over. The future of Aris Thorne's work, a legacy born of genius and tragedy, was now a geopolitical football, its destiny uncertain, its potential for good or ill amplified 1,000-fold. The world outside felt louder, more chaotic. The immediate task was done, David Thorne was apprehended, the conspiracy exposed. My role in uncovering the truth felt small against the enormity of what had been unleashed. The tension in the air was palpable, not just from the public outcry, but from the silent, desperate scramble for control over a power too great for any one entity to wield responsibly. I ran a gloved hand over the stainless steel surface of an examination table, the metal cold and unyielding beneath the latex. Aris Thorne's name, once whispered in hushed scientific circles, now resonated in public discourse. The man who had envisioned a revolutionary leap for humanity had instead become a cautionary tale, his brilliance hijacked, his life extinguished. I thought of the initial scene, the charred remnants of his lab, the carefully constructed illusion of an accident. It had taken weeks, months, to peel back those layers, to sift through the ash and the lies, to find the microscopic anomalies that pointed not to miscalculation, but to malice. The lead investigator had called it a triumph, a textbook unraveling of a complex conspiracy. I saw it differently. Each successful case was a victory, yes, but also a stark reminder of the depths of human depravity. David Thorne and his co-conspirators were behind bars, their ambitions of weaponizing Aris's research thwarted, at least for now. The public outcry had been immense, fueling a fierce global debate on scientific ethics, on the responsibility of innovators, and the ever-present shadow of exploitation. That, at least, was a tangible outcome, a ripple effect from the truth we had unearthed. But the triumph felt heavy. I remembered the long nights, the endless re-examinations of data, the frustrating dead ends. The faces of the victims, even those I never met, seemed to accumulate in the quiet corners of my mind. Aris Thorne, brilliant and naive, believing in the inherent good of his creation. His lead researcher, caught in the crossfire, a silent testament to the ruthlessness of the plot. Their stories, once fragmented, had been painstakingly pieced together, given voice through the silent language of forensic evidence. The cost of such truth was not just time or effort. It was the erosion of a certain innocence, the constant exposure to the darker currents of ambition and betrayal. I felt it, a subtle shift in my own perspective, a deeper skepticism that settled into the marrow of my bones. Trust became a commodity earned through rigorous scrutiny, not freely given. Every new face, every new statement, was filtered through a lens of potential deception. It was a necessary defense mechanism in my line of work, but it bled into the periphery of my life, leaving me perpetually on guard. A colleague entered the section, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. He carried a tablet, its screen glowing faintly. "Read," he said, his voice low, "the final report on the Thorne case is ready. For your signature." The unidentifiable compounds? "Still under review by the specialists," he replied, scrolling on the tablet. "Highly volatile. We've secured it, of course. No further immediate threat." Immediate threat, I repeated, a bitter taste in my mouth. But the potential remains. The very idea of Aris Thorne's work, even in its weaponized form, existing, still being analyzed, still holding secrets, was a stark reminder that the fight wasn't over. The specific case was closed, the perpetrators identified and apprehended. But the larger struggle, the one between humanity's relentless drive for progress and its equally potent capacity for destruction, that would never truly end. I walked over to the colleague, signing the digital document with a practiced flourish. The Thorne case was a closed chapter, a monumental effort that had brought a measure of justice. The system, imperfect as it was, had worked. But the questions Aris Thorne's research had posed, the ethical quandaries it had ignited, continued to burn. "There's something else," the colleague said, his gaze fixed on the tablet. "A preliminary inquiry just came through. Remote facility, deep desert. A structural engineer, found dead, ostensibly a collapse during a routine inspection. But the initial site photos. They're showing some peculiar stress fractures. Not consistent with typical fatigue." He looked up, meeting my eyes. "They want you to take a look." A familiar spark ignited within me, pushing back against the weariness. Peculiar stress fractures. Not consistent. It was always in the inconsistencies, the subtle deviations from the expected, that the truth lay hidden. The echoes of Aris Thorne's case, the profound impact of his stolen legacy, would always serve as a reminder of the stakes. I took a deep breath, the scent of antiseptic invigorating rather than stifling this time. "Send me the file," I said. "I'll review it on the way." The desert awaited, and with it, another intricate puzzle, another truth demanding to be unearthed. The struggle continued. And so did I.